In October 2019, the air inside the abandoned Blackwood coal mine was so heavy it was difficult to breathe, the smell of damp decay clinging to the rock walls as each slow, steady drop of water echoed through the tunnel like an old clock still counting time for a secret never spoken aloud. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Tanner stepped cautiously inside, expecting nothing more than a routine call curious teenagers, a few warnings, and then home. Because in Pike County, calls like this were common, and the Blackwood mine, closed for decades, had long been forgotten like an old memory the town no longer revisited. But when his flashlight swept across a narrow side tunnel, Marcus stopped, confronted by a wall of stone and timber crudely built yet unmistakably deliberate, not the result of a natural collapse or a safety barrier, but something that looked as though someone, long ago, had intentionally sealed the passage shut. A chill ran down his spine as he radioed for backup and forensic units, then knelt to remove the stones one by one, placing each carefully aside as if afraid of disturbing whatever lay behind them. When the opening finally widened, his flashlight revealed a small chamber, and in that moment, time seemed to stop. Two sets of human remains lay side by side, not dumped or discarded, but placed parallel to one another, close enough to suggest that, before everything ended, they were still together. Nearby, half buried in the dark soil, lay a silver pendant dulled by years underground, and when Marcus picked it up, he saw two carefully engraved letters scratched into its surface SM. The name Sarah Martinez immediately came to mind, a name familiar to anyone who had grown up in Pike County, recalling the twin sisters who left a diner on an autumn night in 1974 and vanished on the familiar road home without screams, without evidence, without explanation, leaving behind a family torn apart and a town haunted by the same unanswered question for 45 years. Standing in the cold darkness of the mine, Marcus understood this was not merely a discovery, but a whisper from the past, a truth buried for far too long and now demanding to be heard. And what made the story truly terrifying was not just that the girls had been found, but that as the investigation began again and the pieces were finally placed together, it became clear the person responsible had never left. He hadn't fled. He hadn't disappeared. He had lived here in this town for 45 years, trusted, greeted, and considered familiar. And tonight, to understand why two young women never made it home, and why sometimes the most frightening thing of all is what stands closest to us, we must return to the moment when everything began. In 1974, Pike County, Alabama was a place where people believed that bad things always happened somewhere far away, far from the red dust back roads, far from the porches that stayed lit every night, far from the familiar nods neighbors exchanged as they passed one another. It was a town where everyone believed they were living the right way. Doors were rarely locked. Children played outside until the streetlights came on, and adults recognized one another's cars and daily routines as if the entire town were a single household. In the mornings, men went to the fields, the workshops, or down into the mines, returning each afternoon carrying the familiar smell of sweat, dirt, and exhaustion, while women tended to cooking, laundry, and their children's schooling, and weekends revolved around church, shared meals, and laughter rising from stories told again and again. Back then, people in Pike County believed in one word: safety, not because sorrow had never touched the town, but because they believed terrible things did not choose familiar faces, hardworking families, or good children. Sarah and Rebecca Martinez grew up within that belief, in a family that was not wealthy but respectable, not loud but warm, with a father who worked relentlessly in the coal mine and a mother who guarded their home as if protecting a promise, while the twin daughters worked, helped support the family, and lived exactly as the town expected young people to live. That was why, when the twins disappeared, Pike County did not simply lose two young women, it lost the certainty people clung to each day. At first, the town reassured itself that the girls were merely late or had gone somewhere else, that everything would be fine by morning. But as hours turned into days, that belief began to fracture. People started looking at one another differently, As suspicious glances replaced familiar smiles and whispered questions crept into dinners and gatherings, who had seen them last, who had been on that road that night, and who might know something they had never said. A town once proud of its closeness began to fear it, because if everyone knew everyone else, then the person responsible could not have been a stranger, and that realization, not simply the disappearance itself, was the greatest shock Pike County faced in 1974, marking the moment the town was never quite the same again, and leaving behind a quiet fracture that would stretch across decades. Sarah and Rebecca Martinez were so alike that, to a stranger, they seemed almost like a single person, sharing the same thick black hair always neatly brushed, the same warm brown eyes that looked at others with a rare sincerity, and the same small, familiar frames that stood out in a town where very few Latin families lived. But to their family, and to those who truly knew them, the twins were profoundly different. Sarah, older by 7 minutes, carried herself with quiet calm. She spoke little, but every word was considered, and she was the one who remembered schedules, appointments, and the smallest details, like when the house had run out of salt or when their mother was tired from a sleepless night. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, not out of ambition, but because she wanted to ease other people's pain, believing that if one lived kindly and worked hard, life would not turn its back on you. Rebecca Becca, as everyone called her, was like a breeze, smiling easily and speaking naturally with anyone she met, drawn to music, and often bringing her guitar out to the porch in the late afternoons, softly playing and singing as the day faded. She once said she wanted to leave Pike County someday, to see how wide the world really was, not to escape, but to understand who she was within it. The twins went everywhere together, not because they couldn't be apart, but because together the world felt safer. When Sarah worried, Rebecca pulled her back into the present, and when Rebecca drifted too far into dreams, Sarah kept her grounded. They were two imperfect halves that fit together just right. The Martinez family lived simply, with a father, Robert, who worked long days in the Blackwood coal mine, leaving before dawn and returning with sweat-soaked clothes and calloused hands. A quiet man who spoke little but listened closely, believing family was something you proved through action, not words. Their mother, Maria, was the heart of the home, cooking, cleaning, praying, and always waiting for her daughters to return on time, believing in God, in family, and in the idea that as long as everyone stayed together, any hardship could be endured. Sarah and Rebecca understood that, which was why they worked at Murphy's Diner, not just to earn money, but to help keep their family whole, every tip and every long shift carrying the thought that they were building a small but steady future. No one in that family imagined that a single ordinary evening could take everything away, or that two girls who always walked together and always chose the familiar road would never make it back to their front door. When Sarah and Rebecca disappeared, it wasn't just two people who vanished from Pike County. A part of the Martinez family's soul went with them, and the most painful truth was that, for years afterward, the memory of the twins remained as vivid as if it were yesterday, as though one only needed to turn around to find them still standing there, side by side, smiling and asking whether dinner would be late tonight. October 17, 1974, began like any other day in Pike County, with a gentle morning sun and a warm afternoon, offering no hint that by nightfall it would become the deepest wound in the town's history. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Sarah and Rebecca Martinez arrived for their shift at Murphy's Diner, dressed in clean blue uniforms with white aprons tied neatly behind their backs, the smell of hot coffee filling the room alongside the familiar scents of baked goods and frying oil. Murphy's was more than a diner. It was a daily gathering place, a stopping point for small talk, laughter, and greetings exchanged out of habit. Sarah worked quietly and carefully, wiping tables, pouring coffee, refilling salt and pepper shakers, every small task done with practiced routine, while Rebecca was different, chatting easily with customers, asking about their day, joking with familiar faces, and brightening the room with a smile some said could soften even the longest, most tiring day. That afternoon was busier than usual, with a sales meeting in town drawing unfamiliar faces, and the twins worked without pause. Though no one noticed any sign of fatigue, this was simply another ordinary shift, a familiar rhythm of life. A little after 8 o'clock, they began closing up, counting tips and slipping the money into their bags, hanging their aprons on hooks and adjusting their hair in the small mirror behind the counter. And before leaving, Sarah turned back to smile at the evening manager and said she would see him tomorrow, unaware it would be her last goodbye. Outside, the air was cooler, an autumn breeze moving softly along the street as the sisters walked side by side, just as they had hundreds of times before, the route home so familiar they could have walked it in the dark without thinking. They stopped at Henderson's drugstore to buy their mother a birthday card, choosing one with roses, the clerk later remembering that the girls seemed relaxed and unhurried, Sarah asking about simpler designs while Rebecca laughed at one that was too brightly colored before shaking her head. After paying and saying goodbye, they stepped back outside, and around 8:30, they turned onto Pine Street, where the streetlights cast a pale yellow glow across the pavement. Houses lay quiet after dinner, and the sound of a television drifted from somewhere nearby, an ordinary, peaceful evening that offered no reason for fear. As they continued walking, they talked softly about small things, perhaps their shift that day, dinner at home, or their mother's upcoming birthday words no one else heard, moments no one witnessed, until somewhere along that familiar road, they vanished. There were no recorded cries for help, no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who could say they had seen anything clearly, only two young women who never reached their front door. Just after 9 o'clock, Maria Martinez began to feel uneasy, and by 10 she called Murphy's Diner, her concern turning to fear when she learned her daughters had left long ago, and near midnight, Robert Martinez drove through the town, calling their names in growing desperation. The night of October 17, 1974, ended in silence, a heavy silence that no one in Pike County understood at the time would stretch on for the next 45 years. When the clock reached 9:15 p.m., Maria Martinez began to feel uneasy. Sarah and Rebecca had never come home late without calling ahead. Even if they were delayed by 10 minutes, they would phone, an ordinary habit, but one that was enough for a mother to sense that something was wrong. She stood and looked out the window, finding the street in front of the house empty, with no footsteps and no familiar silhouettes, then turned back to the kitchen and checked the clock again, as if staring long enough might make the hands move backward. At 10 o'clock, she called Murphy's Diner, and when the manager told her the girls had clocked out long ago, her voice fell silent as worry hardened into a cold weight in her chest. She called her husband, Robert, urging him to come home earlier than usual, and he said little, pulling on his jacket, grabbing his car keys, and heading straight back out into the night. He drove slowly through the familiar streets, scanning porches and dark corners, calling his daughters' names without realizing he was doing it, each intersection offering a brief flicker of hope before it disappeared. Near midnight, after every road had been covered, the Martinez family went to the police station and explained everything: the end of the girls' shift, their route home, their habits, speaking carefully, as if enough detail might somehow bring them back. The response they received was cautious. 2 adult women missing for less than a night. Perhaps they were out with friends. Perhaps they had gone somewhere on their own. Perhaps things would be clearer in the morning, and the police advised the family to wait. To a mother, that advice felt like a dull knife. How could she sleep when her children were not home? How could she wait when every passing minute carried more fear? That night, Maria sat in the living room without changing her clothes or closing her eyes, listening to every sound outside and rising suddenly whenever headlights passed the window, while Robert sat beside her in silence, his hands clenched as though letting go would cause him to collapse. When dawn finally came, Sarah and Rebecca still had not returned, their beds untouched, their handbags hanging where they always were, everything exactly as it should have been except for the 2 people who were gone. That morning, Pike County woke without knowing the town had just entered a new chapter, while for the Martinez family, that moment marked the beginning of a waiting that would have no end. As the sun rose higher on the morning of October 18, 1974, Pike County was no longer the quiet town it had been the day before. News of the Martinez twins' disappearance spread quickly, moving from house to house, from coffee shops to churches, from schools to distant fields, and everyone who heard it seemed to pause for a moment, as if struggling to believe it was real. Searches began almost immediately, as neighbors, friends, and Sarah and Rebecca's co-workers from Murphy's Diner gathered outside the Martinez home, some carrying flashlights, others holding sticks, a few bringing dogs. Dividing themselves along the familiar route, the sisters walked home each night, bending down to inspect patches of grass and drainage ditches, calling the girls' names in broad daylight as if afraid the darkness had never truly left. Robert Martinez joined every group, saying little, simply walking, watching, and remembering, his heart tightening each time someone called out his daughter's names, then falling hollow again when no answer came. Police soon launched an official investigation, compiling lists of the last people who had seen Sarah and Rebecca, checking abandoned buildings, footpaths on the edge of town, and empty lots rarely visited by children. Yet the more they searched, the more the emptiness revealed itself. No signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, nothing to prove that something terrible had happened there at all. Then the whispers began. Someone claimed to have seen the girls with a strange man. Another believed they had gotten into a car with someone they knew. Others were certain the disappearance was no accident, but every rumor, urgent as it sounded, dissolved under scrutiny. Amid the confusion, one detail stood out: a blue pickup truck. 3 different people, in 3 different places, mentioned it: an elderly man walking his dog, a young couple sitting on their porch, and a late-night worker near the church, all recalling that around the time Sarah and Rebecca left the drugstore, a blue pickup truck had been parked nearby with its engine running, as if waiting for someone. The truck became the focus of the investigation. Lists of blue pickups in the area were drawn up, dozens of names were called in, and dozens of interviews were conducted in small rooms where ceiling fans turned slowly and sweat soaked through pressed shirts. A first suspect emerged, a man who lived nearby, and admitted he had been in the area that night, claiming his truck had broken down briefly before he went home. A story his wife confirmed, leaving police with no evidence to challenge it and no legal grounds to hold him. And just like that, the strongest lead slipped away. As days passed, the search grew heavier, footsteps slowed, hope dimmed in people's eyes, and words of encouragement became more cautious, while the Martinez family continued to wait and believe, slowly realizing that finding the truth would not be simple. The initial investigation closed with a sense of incompleteness, not because no one cared, but because no one knew where to look next, and as the town's attention turned outward, no one noticed that the answer might have been very close, so close it blended into the familiar faces, seen every day. As the days of searching gradually grew fewer, as the roads were combed over so many times that no one truly believed anything new would be found, the Martinez family entered a different phase, a phase of waiting, with no timeline, no promises, and no clear end. Robert Martinez refused to accept that silence. To him, not finding his daughters simply meant the search had not gone far enough. Just weeks after Sarah and Rebecca disappeared, he quit his job at the Blackwood coal mine, leaving behind the rigid rhythm of shift work for a life governed by obsession. He turned the small garage behind the house into his own command center, pinning a map of Pike County to the wall, spreading papers and handwritten notes across the table, names circled, crossed out, and revisited again and again. Each morning, he left the house before the fog had lifted, traveling to places the police had already abandoned: empty houses, little-used paths, low stretches of land near the woods, asking the same questions others had grown tired of answering. Some people avoided him, some pitied him, some grew weary, but Robert did not, because to him, exhaustion was a luxury he could not afford. If he stopped, he feared his daughters would be forgotten. Maria Martinez lived a very different life during those years. While Robert pushed outward, she retreated inward, rarely leaving the house and preserving every corner as if time itself might reverse so long as nothing changed. The door to Sarah and Rebecca's bedroom was never closed, their beds always made, their clothes washed and neatly hung, their books left on the shelves, dust wiped away, not because it accumulated, but because Maria feared that if the room changed, her daughters might not recognize the place they were meant to return to. Every evening, around the hour they should have come home, she sat by the window, never calling their names, never crying aloud, simply waiting in silence, believing that if she were patient enough, a miracle might still happen. Years passed and Pike County changed, shops closed, roads widened, familiar faces moved away and strangers arrived, but inside the Martinez home, time seemed frozen in October 1974. Miguel and Lucia grew up in that absence, losing their sisters and, in another way, slowly losing their parents too, a father always searching, a mother always waiting, leaving the children to learn how to care for themselves, how to stay quiet, how to carry a grief they did not know where to set down. Some nights, Lucia would wake to find her father sitting alone in the garage, yellow light casting shadows across a face deeply worn by time, his eyes fixed on the map while his thoughts drifted elsewhere, perhaps imagining what his daughters had seen in their final moments. For Maria, hope never disappeared. She never said her daughters were dead, not once to her. They were simply not home yet, and when a mother believes that, no one can convince her otherwise. 45 years passed this way, without noise or resolution, just a pain carried daily like breath, and through all those years, the one thing the Martinez family never did was give up. On October 12, 2019, autumn returned once again to Pike County, bringing with it cool air that felt eerily similar to the fall days of 45 years earlier. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Tanner received a call reporting a group of teenagers trespassing inside the abandoned Blackwood coal mine, a familiar assignment and one he assumed would end quickly. Blackwood Mine had been closed since the early 1980s, its entrances sealed on paper, though time, weather, and human curiosity had a way of reopening places meant to be forgotten. Marcus entered the mine with a flashlight in hand, the space inside cold and damp, the air thick enough that every breath felt as though it required permission from the darkness, his footsteps echoing loudly and making him acutely aware of his own isolation beneath the earth. He walked deeper than expected, until he reached a side tunnel not clearly marked on modern maps, where he stopped in front of a wall made of stone and timber, uneven and crudely assembled, yet unmistakably artificial. It did not resemble the mine's standard safety barriers. It looked like a hurried act, a decision made in silence, an attempt to conceal something. Marcus felt his heartbeat slow as he radioed for assistance, his voice steady but weighted by an instinct he could not explain, telling him that whatever lay behind the wall was not something he wanted to find. When the first stones were removed, colder air spilled out from behind it, his flashlight cutting into a small hidden space until the beam landed on what made him freeze two sets of human remains, lying close together, parallel, not scattered or discarded, but carefully placed, as if someone had paused to arrange them before leaving forever. Marcus knelt at a distance. He had seen many things in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this, and in that moment he was not only a police officer, but a human being standing before the end of two lives. Near the remains, half buried in dirt and rock, lay an old silver pendant which he lifted and gently wiped clean, revealing two deeply engraved letters dulled by time SM. In that instant, a story he had heard since childhood became terrifyingly real. The Martinez twins, missing since 1974, without answers, without traces, a wound Pike County had never truly closed. Blackwood Mine, once a source of livelihood for so many families, had now revealed its darkest secret, and after 45 years of silence, the truth had finally found its way back to the surface. And with that discovery came a question that haunted everyone present: if they had been here all along, then where had the person who brought them here been living for the past 45 years? Immediately after the discovery was reported, the Blackwood coal mine was sealed off, its entrances placed under strict guard, and floodlights erected across land that for decades had known only wind and weeds, because a secret buried for so long now demanded absolute care. Forensic specialists entered the mine slowly, aware that they were working not only with bones, but with time itself. 45 years of silence embedded in every grain of soil, every fragment of decayed fabric, every faint trace that only modern science could still hear. The two sets of remains were documented, measured, and marked in place, and their position spoke volumes. Lying parallel, close together, with no signs of dragging or disorder, indicating this was not a site of careless disposal, but a location where someone had deliberately brought them and carefully laid them down. Identification followed soon after, as bone samples were sent for analysis, and DNA technology, unavailable in 1974, became the bridge between present and past, confirming what the Martinez family had waited nearly half a century to know: they were Sarah and Rebecca. There was no celebration, only a heavy silence in the room as the results were read aloud, because while it was a professional success for investigators, it was also the moment a family received the truth at the cost of its final hope. The cause of death was determined later, with fractures to the skulls indicating both women had been struck with a blunt object, the injuries similar in placement and severity, suggesting the attack was not random, but controlled, delivered from behind, quickly and decisively. What was most disturbing was not how they died, but that the person responsible knew them well enough to approach without alarm, to take them without resistance, and to leave no trace along a public route. Soil samples from the mine were also analyzed, and the fine dust and mineral fragments told their own story, revealing that the area had been accessed after it was officially sealed, meaning the person who brought Sarah and Rebecca there was not only familiar with Blackwood Mine, but knew its hidden paths better than most. With that, the clues began to narrow the circle. This was not the act of a stranger or a random crime, but the work of someone who belonged to this place, someone who once walked these tunnels as part of daily life. Science had done what human effort could not for 45 years. It had not only answered who they were, but whispered a far more unsettling question. If the truth lay buried underground for all that time, how had the person who buried it managed to live above ground, among everyone else, as if nothing had ever happened? Howard Keller was not a name that made people stop and take notice. For 45 years, it existed in Pike County like any other, unremarkable, uncontroversial, attached to nothing that demanded suspicion. By 2019, Howard Keller was a man in his 80s, living alone in a small house with a neatly trimmed front lawn, a low fence, and an unlocked gate, taking his trash out on schedule every morning and standing on his porch each afternoon, watching cars pass with the gentle indifference of someone who had lived long enough to feel no urgency. His neighbors knew him. They greeted him. Some remembered asking him to fix a fan or an electrical outlet. Others recalled his quiet manners and politeness. He caused no trouble, asked no prying questions, kept neither distance nor intrusion. His presence was just ordinary enough to escape notice. Howard Keller attended church, sitting in familiar pews, listening to sermons, bowing his head in prayer like everyone else, and when memorial services were held for the Martinez twins, he was there too, standing quietly at the back, head lowered, his expression solemn enough to raise no doubts. For 45 years, he lived among a community haunted by the very crime he had committed, listening as people spoke Sarah and Rebecca's names, as they shared grief, theories, and anger, while he remained silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that as long as he continued being ordinary, the world would never look at him. When investigators reopened the case, his name first appeared only faintly in the records. A former mine worker, someone who knew the Martinez family, an old statement claiming he had been home that night. But as the pieces were placed together, that normalcy began to fracture. He had worked at Blackwood Mine, knew its tunnels intimately, knew which areas were sealed on paper yet still accessible in reality. He had been a regular at Murphy's Diner, sat at familiar tables, watched the twins work, asked questions that seemed harmless, and been politely turned away. No one could recall exactly when his attention began, because it was never loud or forceful. It was quiet, persistent, and carefully hidden beneath the mask of a decent, aging man. What sent a chill through Pike County was not simply that Howard Keller became a suspect, but that, looking back, people realized he had been present at so many pivotal moments. He had watched the Martinez family collapse, seen the father posting flyers, seen the mother sitting by the window each night, and through all of it, he had gone on living, eating dinner, sleeping peacefully, attending church, growing old. The killer had not hidden in the shadows or vanished from the community. He survived by becoming part of it, and as the truth emerged, Pike County was forced to confront a question that left everyone cold. If Howard Keller could live an ordinary life for 45 years, how many other dark truths had been concealed by just one word: normal? On the morning of October 25, 2019, Pike County woke to a scene no one could have imagined. As police cars quietly pulled up before dawn outside a familiar house on Maple Street, without sirens or spectacle, only the heavy sound of footsteps on a concrete path that for decades had seemed harmless. Howard Keller was arrested in the very place where he had lived for nearly half a century, an elderly man stepping out in his pajamas, hands trembling as he raised them, offering no resistance and no protest, his face empty, as if he had long been prepared for this moment. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, some unable to believe what they were seeing, others breaking down in tears, some shaking their heads as if trying to wake from a nightmare, as the man they had greeted each morning and trusted for years was led away for a crime that had haunted the town. The news spread faster than any explanation, plunging Pike County into a collective shock, not because an evil man had been caught, but because that evil had been here all along, present at church services, community gatherings, and during the most painful years of the Martinez family's suffering. For that family, the news brought no sense of relief. Robert Martinez was too frail to stand for long, and when he learned that the person responsible for his daughter's deaths had been arrested, he simply sat in silence, neither crying nor speaking, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if trying to piece together 45 shattered years. Maria Martinez did not go to the scene and refused to appear in public, saying that seeing the man who took her daughters was not justice but another kind of pain, that she had already seen enough, and that 45 years of waiting had taken all the strength she had left. The trial unfolded in a heavy atmosphere, Howard Keller sitting silently, not looking around, not reacting, as evidence was presented slowly and methodically, the truths uncovered by time and science finally spoken aloud before the entire town. The people of Pike County sat in the gallery without a word, each detail cutting into their shared memory: years spent believing the killer was an outsider, moments of comforting the Martinez family while the truth lived right beside them. When the verdict was delivered, there was no celebration, only a long, lingering silence, because justice had come late, too late to heal, too late to return what had been lost. For the Martinez family, the trial was not an ending, only the end of a question: where their daughters had gone and who had done this, while the pain itself carried no sentence and no closure. And for Pike County, that day marked a truth difficult to swallow: not every monster wears a frightening face. And sometimes what destroys a community most completely is the realization that they lived next to evil for nearly half a century without ever knowing it. After the legal proceedings ended and the courtroom doors finally closed, Pike County slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Streets grew quiet again. Churches opened their doors each weekend, and people greeted one another as they always had, but one thing could never truly return to what it once was. Justice had been carried out, yet it did not bring Sarah and Rebecca home, nor did it restore the 45 years the Martinez family had paid for with tears, hope, and countless sleepless nights. Justice answered questions, but it did not heal wounds. Robert Martinez passed away not long after, a father who had spent nearly his entire life searching for his daughters and who, at last, received the truth at the cost of a lifetime of quiet suffering. People said he went peacefully, but peace did not mean the absence of pain. Maria Martinez, for the first time in decades, allowed herself to close her daughter's bedroom door, not because she had forgotten them, but because she understood that waiting any longer would not bring them back. She kept a few photographs and small keepsakes and gave the rest away, a way of ensuring that the pain did not remain trapped within that house alone. For Pike County, the story of the Martinez twins became a quiet reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that evil does not always wear a frightening face, and that silence, when allowed to last long enough, can destroy an entire family. Some cases end with a verdict, but others continue to live on in the memories of those left behind. And if you are listening now, take a moment to think of Sarah and Rebecca, two young women who lived ordinary lives, loved their family, and believed they would return home safely on an autumn evening. This story is not told merely to recount a crime, but to remind us that every victim is a person, every family carries a pain beyond measure, and while justice may arrive late, listening, remembering, and refusing to forget are things we can still choose to do, right now.